All right, AP Environmental Science students, just wanted to go over this second FRQ with you for unit number 3. This one, I like this one. This is kind of short. It's not a very big passage, but there's 4 really good questions that they ask you about this particular passage. So I'll briefly read this to you. It says a species of woodpecker inhabits a reserve adjacent to a suburban housing development. So imagine there's a little forest right next to a neighborhood or something. The species nests in cavities, that's like holes, that it excavates in large trees and rarely crosses roads or areas that do not provide at least some vegetation cover. So basically, what they're kind of describing there is that it's like a fragmented habitat, right? It's like they won't cross roads, so they're kind of isolated to that one little, almost like an island habitat. The population inside the reserve is small. That's important, and relatively isolated from other larger populations in the region. So they give you, even though it's a short paragraph, there's some good information there that they give you about this particular species. So question A, describe one density dependent and one density independent factor that could affect the woodpecker population in the reserve. So you get 1 point for each one. So this is where you might want to familiarize yourselves with that list of density dependent and density independent limiting factors that I gave you in your notes. So here's some good answers to that. Right, density dependent would be things like competition, disease, predation. These are things that will affect the woodpecker populations more as their populations become more dense. But it mentions that the populations are kind of small, so maybe these things wouldn't affect them as much, all right, because there's not a lot of woodpeckers maybe in this particular area. Now, density independent would be things like natural disasters, and those things are going to, if they do occur, they're going to affect the population regardless of how big it is. So if it's a small population, it might be completely wiped out by a natural disasters, but so could a larger population, right? So just make sure you list one of those, each of one of those, and you also kind of describe, what those things are. Question B: describe 2 potential problems with the isolation and lack of gene flow the population experiences due to the housing development. So this kind of takes us back into Unit 2 a little bit, even though this is a Unit 3 FRQ. It does kind of build upon things that we learned previously. So, one thing that I think that we should probably understand is that this is a small population, and there's not a lot of genetic variation in a small population, right? So if there's little genetic variation, that probably means that if there's any type of disruption to this ecosystem, there's going to be some difficulties, right? They're going to have difficulty adapting. They're going to be vulnerable to a lot of environmental conditions. So that will be something that you probably want to write about. That's in that first paragraph there. But the other thing too is, and I'm going to guess a lot of you mentioned this, um, you know, inbreeding. Once those populations get low, and they are in this case, there's something called inbreeding depression. You didn't have to use that term necessarily, but it is a good term to use. Again, as those populations get smaller, individuals are forced to breed with relatives, right? Cousins and brothers and sisters, and that's all because there's just not enough or there's not enough variety at the species level. So, inbreeding depression, when that does occur, that can really take a toll on the population. All right, so you had to mention 2 things. That would probably be one of the harder questions for kids to get, I think, on the FRQ. If you can just get one of those 2 things, I think you'd be I think you would be at the advantage over kids nationally. So I think a lot of kids probably couldn't get one of those, but I don't know, you guys should be able to get at least one. Question C: the particular species of woodpecker is an R species. Explain what this is, including 3 typical characteristics of an R species. So this will be a 4-pointer, right? Again, we've just been talking about this. So explain what an R selected species is, then give 3 characteristics. right? So a whole bunch of things here you could have written about with an R species. Okay, so you can read. I'll let you read over that on your own. Letter D. This is the question where I think a lot of kids kind of understood the answer. They kind of knew the answer, but maybe they forgot the vocab term. So it says, after creating and nesting in a tree cavity, the woodpeckers abandon the cavity, allowing it to be used by several other species of cavity nesting birds that are unable to excavate their own cavities. Based on this description, identify the role the woodpecker species plays in the ecosystem. So, if you'll remember, when we talked about ecosystem engineers, that's a big term, right? An ecosystem engineer is an organism that will build habitats or build like nesting sites or just provide homes or build a home for another organism. So that's kind of clearly being described here in this question. So as long as you mention that the woodpecker is an ecosystem engineer, yeah, it didn't ask you to really explain it, even though I kind of typed up a little bit of an explanation here in my answer. As long as you mentioned that it was an ecosystem engineer, I think that would have gotten you the full point or 2 points or whatever it's worth. In fact, for this particular question, this was the question that I graded. All right, I wanted to make sure that you understood that that woodpecker was acting as an ecosystem engineer, which is a type of keystone species. If you mentioned it was a keystone species, but didn't use the word ecosystem engineer, I took a point off. But if you mentioned that they were ecosystem engineers, I gave you two. Even if in addition you wrote down they were a keystone species. All right. So again, I graded these first three questions mainly on completion, but this last one I kind of nitpicked and took some points off if I didn't feel that it was a good enough explanation. All right, guys, that's it for me. Have a good day. Look over that again, and I will see you in class soon.